Now we're going to be talking about operant conditioning. So we talked about Pavlov and classical conditioning. Now we're going to talk about Skinner and operant conditioning. Now, as Pavlov, his learning was due to learning through association. We have operant conditioning with Skinner that takes a look at the consequences. So operant conditioning involves learning that is affected by the consequences, by either reinforcement or punishment or a mixture of both. Okay, so here is an example of the law of effect by Edward Thorndike. Kind of gives you a good idea of how animals learn and how we learn to as well, based upon trial and error and consequences of your behavior. So hopefully you learn. So let's take a look.
But how is a new skill learned? That was a question which began to fascinate Thorndike. To answer it, he built some ingenious puzzle boxes from which cats could only escape by operating latches. But Thorndike didn't believe that an animal, even a clever cat, understands the consequences of its behavior. When he placed a cat in the puzzle box for the first time, Thorndike was unable to see any evidence of flashes of insight. The successful actions appeared first by chance. He proved that the apparent cleverness arose by trial and error and used graphs to measure the rate of learning. A well-practiced cat quickly recalls the actions that help it escape to its reward of food. If an action brings a reward, Thorndike believed that the action becomes stamped into the mind. In his thesis, he explained further his ideas about learning, that behavior changes because of its consequences. He called this his law of effect.
So if you really think about it, this makes me think about what I've always told my students, and I'll tell you this too, is that every behavior has a purpose to it. You wouldn't be doing it if you didn't get something out of it, if you didn't get a reinforcement or some type of reward. Thinking is a behavior, remember. You wouldn't think the way you think if you didn't get something out of it. Acting and the over behavior, you wouldn't be doing it if you didn't get something out of it. So basically, we learn through trial and error a lot of times too, but the more that we do it, the better we become at it, the more that we learn it. Now, this can be a good behavior or a bad behavior. I've always told my students, every behavior has a purpose to it. You wouldn't be doing it if you didn't get something out of it. And there's like, well, what do you mean? If somebody, is being abused, what's going on there? So, well, they're getting something out of it. So if you have low self-esteem, the abuse that happens, there's a circle of abuse. When I worked with kids and families in Pasadena, the circle of abuse basically happens when you're in a relationship and the abuse happens. Boom, you know it's going to happen, and then right after that, there's like, oh, I'm sorry, I won't do it again, and then it starts to calm down, and then you realize that there's something else going on that's going to happen. For example, I had this one kid that I worked with who was taken out of the home, and I had the family that came to see, and I was a therapist, and I noticed he would kind of egg on the mom, kind of try to push her buttons to get her angry. I was just watching their interaction, and then you could tell the mom's starting to get upset. So I asked my supervisor, so what's going on here? She said, sometimes the anticipation is worse than the actual abuse. Okay, that's part of the circle of abuse. So you know that the abuse is going to happen. So in order to control the situation, the one who's going to be abused will push and push and push and push, and boom, all of a sudden it's done. Okay, good. And I think that's what he was doing. He's trying to push her because he knows that she gets angry, it's going to come out and he'll be over with. Okay, so the anticipation is worse than the actual abuse. So that behavior got a purpose out of it, even though it's negative. So to think about that, whenever you look at any kind of behavior, it has a purpose to it. You wouldn't be doing it if you didn't get something out of it, be it positive or negative. So let's continue on with the Skinner portion of our show, with the operant conditioning. The learning that occurs when an organism operates on the environment and is affected by the consequences of its actions. In other words, you learn from the consequences, whether you do something or not, or you're getting something out of it, as I said before. Let's take a look at this video, and he will explain it himself.
In the early 1900s, American psychologist Edward Thorndike proposed a learning principle called the law of effect. Behavior, he believed, depends on its consequences. Building on Thorndike's ideas, psychologist B.F. Skinner began a series of animal experiments in the 1930s that led to an understanding of how positive and negative consequences shape behavior. He called this process operant conditioning.
I would define operant conditioning as shaping and maintaining behavior by making sure that reinforcing consequences follow. Let me give you an example. Suppose we have a pigeon here, an ordinary pigeon, but it's quite peacefully walking around in a small space. We watch it and notice what it's doing. Then we decide to condition some bit of its behavior. Suppose we take turning to the left a little bit. The pigeon is hungry, and we can give it a bit of food as what we call a reinforcer. It's a reinforcing consequence. We wait until it turns to the left and then immediately give it a bit of food. Almost at once we can see that it's turning to the left more rapidly than it did before, or more often. Now, if you wait a while and don't do this anymore, the pigeon will stop turning left. It's been extinguished. The response has been extinguished. The operant has been extinguished. Extinction is simply what happens when something no longer pays off. Then let us say you start in reinforcing turning again, but only if the light is on and not when the light is off. What will happen is that the pigeon will turn when the light is on, but not when the light is off. It's form of discrimination. Or suppose you reinforce turning only if it's done quickly. The pigeon will start turning quickly. Or you can put it on a schedule of reinforcement, reinforce every so often. And there are certain schedules that get the pigeon to return very, very rapidly for long periods of time that way. These are various kinds of what we call contingencies of reinforcement, the ways in which the reinforcement is contingent on what the pigeon is doing. And in the laboratory, under very good conditions, you get almost total control. Behavior is shaped and maintained by its consequences, and that is the whole art and science of operant conditioning.
So behavior is shaped and maintained by its consequences. Now think about how it applies to you, okay? Or you go to the casino. Okay, casino isn't going to pay out all the time, but they're going to pay out just enough to keep you going. So you're pulling a lever, just like the pigeon. Another way to think about this too is that how do you train your dog? Or even at SeaWorld, they train dolphins. They give them a reward once they do the behavior correctly that they want to see. So it's behavior modification, and it's ways that you're able to maintain and actually shape people's behaviors. And I mean, I'm going more in depth with this, but for this class right now, I just want you to remember you have those two types of learning. One is learning through association with Pavlov, then you have Skinner basically with learning through your consequences or rewards. So continue on. So now that we have those two types of learning that are tied in together, they call this the ABC of learning, antecedents and consequences. So meld those two things together. Meld Pavlov along with Skinner together, and that's how we learn basically. We learn through association and we learn through the consequences that are there. So if you look at A, the antecedents, the things that come before the response, okay, that's Pavlov, the behavior, and then the consequences, the events that follow the response. I remember working when I was working in East LA as a therapist, and I worked with adult children of alcoholics, and a lot of them would report when they were growing up that they didn't know whenever they heard, again, they heard the car driving in, their parent coming in, and that was learning through association. They just heard that and they know, okay, something's going to happen. They didn't know whether say the father was a mean drunk this time or a pleasant drunk. Okay, so they always said they were walking on eggshells. So they're always making sure that everything's okay. Sometimes they'll hide. In order for them to survive, they had to go through this certain kind of codependency. And that's what ends up happening with a lot of codependent people too. They learned to respond to the situation situations that they find themselves in. The neat thing about learning those, it can be unlearned, can be relearned into something that's more positive. A lot of the therapy that we tried to do with these groups was trying to get them to go through and clear out those emotions, understand them, but then also start to make new associations with those type of experiences. Hopefully that makes sense for you. One of the big things that we look at when you're looking at operant conditioning are the reinforcements. Again, we're always being reinforced somehow. There's something that will strengthen that behavior to happen again. So something that a student of mine one time said, so wait a minute, so if your wife is angry at you and then she is giving you the silent treatment, is that a reward or a punishment? Because it could be a reward if you don't want her to talk to you, but then to her it's a punishment. Hey, you choose. So I'm not really sure. But anyway, so you got a reinforcement. You're always being reinforced by something. That's why I say that every behavior has a purpose to it. You wouldn't be doing it if you didn't get something out of it. The last part I want to go over with you is social modeling theory, or at least social learning theory, Bandura. Albert Bandura had this theory that majority of the learning that we do is based upon how we observe others and how they behave. So that's social learning theory. And I love this video, and I'm going to go ahead and let it play. And this is from his experiment that he did in the 60s, where the kids were actually looking and watching the parent, and then they started modeling what the parent did. So you got to be very careful, because kids are always watching. They're seeing you, and you wonder, where did my kids learn all that from? Well, guess what? Learned it from you by observing you. They're very observant. So take a look, see.
This is an example of Bandura's social learning theory or modeling theory, where we learn by watching others and to know how to act in society. So this is from his experiment in the 60s. You can see that the parent is hitting the little doll, and the little kids are watching what mom is doing. Picks up a hammer, and she goes at it with the little cutie doll. Now the kids are watching, and they're going to see what mom did. And then, little boy's going, what did mama had? Oh, there it is. Pick me up a little hammer. So that's how mama doing it. So I'm going to do the same thing that mama did. But check out his face, though. He started getting a little bit angry there. Yeah, we got some anger issues starting young. Now the little girl is really interesting. She's creative. She uses a doll. She doesn't need no sticking hammer. So yep, but also one of the things that she does too, she gets a little bit more violent. Picks up a little gun and starts shooting it in the bottom. So this is Bandura's modeling or social learning theory.
All right. That was kind of fun. So anyway, so beware, again, as a recap, there's two types of basic learning that we do. And one is Pavlov, learning through association. And then there's Skinner, which is learning through your consequences or reinforcement and so forth. Then you have Bandura, which, you learn through modeling. So hopefully this helps. If you have any questions, let me know. Put them in the comments below. And hopefully this help make some sense to you. So we'll talk later. Take care. Bye.